All right, hello everybody. So for today's lesson, we are going to get started on our learning the different anatomy of a flower. So this flower specifically is called a monoecious flower. And what that means is that we have both the male and the female parts on this diagram. So there are also plants that are called dioecious, which means that they have the male and female parts on separate plants. And so this is just one example of a flower, but it helps simplify our diagram by putting it all in one. So to start off, so we all know we see the leaves in a flower, and so this is where photosynthesis happens. So that is where we are creating the food that the plant is going to utilize. And then we have the stem. So we all know about the stem, but what many people don't know are the parts of the stem that are pretty important for transportation. So we have the xylem and the phloem, which we are going to focus on. And the cambium is just held right there in between the xylem and the phloem. So basically, the function of the xylem is to transport water from the roots to the stem and leaves. And it also transports different other dissolved components, but we will mostly focus on the water aspect. So let's say that we're looking at this flower and say this is maybe the soil line right here. Soil line. And then we have our roots down here. Okay, so we will have little root hairs down here, that those are where the primary, better put it up a little bit. This is where primarily we are going to soak in the water from the soil. So that's why when you learn that when you water flowers, you don't want to hit the petals. You want to make sure you get in the soil, because these root hairs are where we mostly soak in all the water. So the root hairs will take that water and it will flow up the roots, and then once we get up to the stem, that xylem, so this inner part right here, is going to work that water up to the stem and the leaves. So we have it in the roots, we're going up, and we go into the leaves, and that helps to keep our plant healthy and hydrated. But then, like I also mentioned, we also have a phloem, which is right here. So a phloem is responsible for transporting food produced from photosynthesis from leaves to the non-photosynthesizing parts of the plant, such as the roots and the stems. So obviously we're producing food up here, but we need to get that down here. And so what is going to happen there is that the phloem, how they're separated so that we can keep the food separate from the water. The phloem is bringing the food down to these roots so that they can continue to grow. So we'll put a little P there. And so that's mostly what you need to know for the stem, are the xylem and the phloem. And then as we move up the flower, you see that we have a receptacle here, which is basically the part of the flower stalk where the parts of the flower are attached. So nothing super big there, but it's important to know that it's right below this ovary right here is the receptacle. And then we have the sepals, which are the outer parts of the flower. Make sure you can see it, which are the outer parts of the flower, and they're often green and leaf-like like this. So a lot of people might mistake these for leaves, but instead they are sepals. Those are the little leaves that are going to be right below, or leaves, I even said it myself. So those are going to be the little green pieces typically that are right under the petals. And they help enclose a developing bud. So before this flower actually blooms, they are going to help keep that bud in, keep it safe, keep dirt out of it, and ensure that it's healthy. All right, and then so that's basically everything that's under the flower. Now, as we move up into the flower, we have a male part and a female part, besides the petals. We'll get back to the petals. So we have the male part, which is the stamen, and we have the female part, which is the pistil. So we will start over here with the pistil. All right, so the main three parts of the pistil are the stigma, style, and ovary. So we always looked at it as SSO. These other parts are also important, but these are the main parts of the female part that we need to know. And then for the male, we have an anther and a filament. Okay, so going back to the female part, like I said, stigma, style, ovary. So the stigma is actually a very sticky part of the plant, and it's right here. Oftentimes when I think of a monoecious plant and I'm trying to think of all the specific parts, I like to think of a lily, because you can really easily see those stigmas on top of the lily and how sticky they are. If you touch it, you can actually feel how incredibly sticky it is. So that is what's going to help stick the pollen onto it. Okay, and then under the stigma, we have the style. And so what the style does is basically the name for the stalk of the pistil. So when pollen reaches the stigma, it begins to grow in the tube through the style called a pollen tube, which will eventually reach the ovary. So like I said, it will grow in the style and go down the pollen tube, and then it will reach the ovary down here. So this whole thing is the ovary. And then these littler ones are the ovules right here. So the style acts as a buffer against pollen contamination, and since it only allows compatible pollen to grow in the pollen tube. So anything else that is allowed in here will not be able to grow and go down the pollen tube, which is why the style and the pollen tube are so important. We only want those specific pieces of pollen, I couldn't think of the word, to go down the pollen tube and hit the ovary and into the ovules. So those are like the flower's eggs. So they're obviously, like I said, located inside the ovary, and when they are fertilized, they will eventually grow into a seed. And in different fruit plants, pollen will not only spark the growth of a seed, but also a surrounding fruit as well. So with flowers, at the end of the season, we see them let go of seeds. So that is the main part of that female side. All right, and then moving over to the male side, like I said, we have the anther and the filament. So the anther is the head of the stamen right here. Again, in lilies, these might be incredibly orange, and they'll have all that pollen on it. So in actual commercial production of floral flowers, so like lilies, they'll actually pull these off because they don't want all the orange on. Maybe if there's white petals, they don't want that orange on the white petals. But if you are trying to reproduce, then you want to get this pollen to the stigma to fertilize those ovules, to fertilize those ovules down there. But so like I said, the anther is responsible for the production of pollen, which will hopefully be transported to the pistil either by animals or insects, or even like in this case, wind. It might be bees as well. So this is a really, really crucial part of that reproduction of the plant, like I said. Okay, and then we have the filament right here. So that's basically just the stalk that holds the anther and attaches it to the flower. So important to hold that anther. And then finally, I said I would get back to the petal. And the petal are what give a flower its unique shape, and they're often brightly colored to attract insects and critters, which will aid in the fertilization of ovules through pollination. So like we talked about, that pollen on the anther needs to get to that stigma somehow. So this beautiful red petal will allow different bees, butterflies to want to come, and they'll get on this flower and get all of the pollen on themselves and drag it up here to the stigma. So those are the basic parts of a flower, like I said. And again, this was a monoecious plant. So dioecious would have this pistil and this stamen on separate plants. And so that produces some challenges because it's a little more difficult to reproduce those plants, as you need those bees and butterflies, whatever's carrying the pollen, to be able to go from the female, or excuse me, from the male plant over to the female to ensure that there's reproduction. And so this is our final picture right here of the monoecious plant. Looking forward to any questions you guys have in class. Remember that you need to create one question for me at the beginning of class and come with lots of good questions. Thanks. See you tomorrow.